The morning rush at Gracie's diner had finally settled, leaving the scent of fresh coffee lingering in the air. Emma wiped her damp hands on her faded apron, stretching her sore shoulders as she glanced at the clock above the counter. It was just past 10, the quiet lull between breakfast and lunch. At only 20 years old, Emma had already learned the weight of exhaustion. Between long shifts at the diner and taking care of her 2-year-old son, Oliver, she was constantly running on fumes. But she never let it show. She had mastered the art of smiling through tiredness, keeping her voice light and warm for every customer who walked through the door. It wasn't just about tips, though she desperately needed them, it was about something deeper. She understood what it felt like to be unseen, to be just another face in the crowd, and she never wanted anyone to feel that way when they came in. The bell above the entrance chimed, and Emma looked up as an elderly man shuffled inside. He was wearing the same tattered coat he always did, the fabric thinning at the elbows. His boots, once sturdy, were worn and scuffed from years of use. The old man moved slowly, his back slightly hunched, but his steps were steady. He always came alone. Emma smiled as he made his way toward his usual booth by the window. "Morning, Walter," she greeted as she walked over. "The usual." Walter nodded, his blue eyes soft but tired. "Morning, dear." "Yes, the usual sounds just fine." Emma had known Walter for almost a year now. He was one of the diner's regulars, always coming in once a week for the same simple meal: 2 eggs, toast, and a cup of coffee. Nothing fancy, but enough to fill him up. She knew he was a veteran, though he never talked much about his service. He didn't talk much about anything, really, but she had grown fond of him. There was something steady and dependable about him, like an old tree that had weathered too many storms but still stood tall. As Emma placed his order, she noticed the way he carefully pulled out his wallet, his fingers slow as they thumbed through the bills. The sight made her chest tighten. She knew that look. She'd seen it in the mirror enough times, counting, calculating, stretching every dollar. She knew Walter wouldn't accept pity, so she decided she wouldn't give him any. She'd just do what felt right. When his meal was ready, she brought it over with an extra slice of toast, something she often did for customers who looked like they could use it. Walter never asked for more, never complained, never expected anything beyond what he paid for. That made her want to give all the more. "Here you go," she said, setting the plate in front of him. "Thank you, Emma," he murmured, already reaching for his coffee. She busied herself with refilling salt shakers and wiping down tables, but she kept an eye on Walter as he ate. He always ate slowly, taking small bites, savoring every piece of food like it was something precious. When he finally finished, he reached for the check, unfolding it with quiet precision. But before he could pull out his money, Emma slid the bill away from him. "It's on me today," she said lightly, as if it were no big deal. Walter frowned, shaking his head. Now, I can't let you do that." "You can," she said simply, smiling. "And you will." He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, there was something unreadable in his expression. "Emma, I appreciate the thought, but I don't take handouts." His voice was gentle but firm. Emma crossed her arms, still smiling. "It's not a handout, it's a thank you. For everything you've done." Walter's mouth pressed into a thin line, but his eyes softened. He looked down at his empty plate, then back up at Emma. "You're a stubborn one," he muttered, but there was a small, tired smile playing at his lips. "I've been told," she said with a grin. He hesitated a moment longer, then finally nodded, accepting the kindness for what it was. "Well then," he said gruffly, clearing his throat. "Thank you, Emma." She gave him a small nod. Anytime. Unbeknownst to either of them, a man at a nearby booth had been listening. He sat alone, his coffee untouched, his sharp eyes studying the scene before him. He had been a regular at the diner for a few weeks now, coming in at odd hours, never drawing much attention to himself. He was well dressed but not flashy. There was a quiet authority to the way he carried himself, like a man used to observing, to waiting. and right now he was waiting. He had seen a lot of people in his life. He had built a business from nothing, had traveled across the country, had met people from every walk of life. But people like Emma, they were rare. Especially at her age. Young people today, he thought to himself, were often too wrapped up in their own struggles to notice others. He understood that it was a hard world, and survival took priority. But here was this girl, barely more than a kid herself, struggling in ways she likely never spoke about, yet still giving without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. That kind of heart couldn't be taught. He set his coffee cup down, a slow smile forming on his lips. He had made a decision. But for now, he would wait. The day stretched on as the lunch rush came and went, and Emma barely had a second to breathe. The clatter of dishes, the hum of conversation, and the steady sizzle of the grill filled the diner, making it feel like a living, breathing thing. By the time the afternoon slowed, Emma finally had a moment to rest. She leaned against the counter, rubbing her lower back. Her shift still had a few hours left, and after that she would pick up Oliver from the neighbor who watched him during the day. She missed him. Every hour she spent away from him was another hour lost, but she had no choice. Bills didn't care about sentiment. She reached for a fresh pot of coffee, pouring a cup for herself when a voice interrupted her thoughts. "Excuse me, miss." Emma turned to see the man who had been sitting near Walter's booth earlier. He had been there for some time, but she hadn't paid him much attention beyond the usual refills and polite conversation. Now, though, he was looking at her with quiet curiosity, as if he had been studying her. She straightened. "Yes, sir? Can I get you something else?" He shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just the check, please." Emma nodded, quickly retrieving it. As she set it down, the man spoke again. "I saw what you did earlier," he said, tapping the paper with a single finger. "For the older gentleman." Emma's stomach tightened. She hadn't done it for recognition. In fact, she hated attention when it came to things like that. It made her feel awkward, like she had to explain herself. She shrugged lightly, trying to brush it off. It was nothing. The man tilted his head, considering her for a moment. No, it wasn't. His voice was calm but firm. Not many people would do that, especially someone in your position. Emma blinked, unsure of what to say. She wasn't sure how he knew she was struggling, but she supposed it wasn't hard to guess. She worked long hours, barely took breaks, and there was a tiredness in her eyes that no amount of sleep could erase. Before she could come up with a response, the man reached into his wallet and pulled out a $100 bill. He slid it across the counter. Her eyes widened. "Sir, I can't take that." "You can," he said simply. "And you will." She let out a small laugh, shaking her head. "That's exactly what I told Walter." The man chuckled. "Then you understand why I won't take no for an answer." Emma hesitated. $100 meant gas in her car for the next 2 weeks. It meant getting Oliver a new pair of shoes without having to choose between that and groceries. It wasn't just money, it was a little bit of breathing room. Still, it felt strange. "I really didn't do it for a reward," she admitted. "I know," the man said. "That's exactly why you deserve one." Emma swallowed the lump in her throat. She was used to scraping by, used to carrying her struggles alone. Moments like this, kindness given freely, felt foreign to her. Slowly, she reached for the bill, folding it carefully before slipping it into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said softly. The man gave her a nod, then stood. He pulled on his coat, adjusting the collar before glancing back at her. "I'll be seeing you again, Emma." She frowned slightly. "You know my name." He chuckled. "Of course I do. I make it a habit to remember good people." And with that, he left. Emma stood there for a long moment, staring at the door after he had gone. Something about the encounter sat heavy in her chest, Not in a bad way, but in a way that made her feel like something bigger was about to happen. But for now, she had a job to finish. She shook off the strange feeling, grabbed the coffee pot, and got back to work. Later that night, when she finally finished her shift, Emma drove to pick up Oliver. The apartment complex was small and old, but safe enough. She climbed the steps, her feet aching with each step, until she reached the door of Mrs. Callahan, her elderly neighbor. Mrs. Callahan greeted her with a warm smile, stepping aside to let her in. He was an angel, as always, she said, gesturing toward Oliver, who was curled up on the couch, clutching his stuffed dinosaur. Emma's heart melted. She scooped him up, pressing a kiss to his soft curls. He stirred slightly but didn't wake, his tiny hand gripping her shirt. "Thank you," Emma whispered. Mrs. Callahan patted her arm. "You work too hard, dear." Emma let out a tired chuckle. No such thing when you've got a little one to take care of. The older woman studied her for a moment before nodding. "You're a good mother, Emma." And Emma's throat tightened. She never felt like she was doing enough. But hearing someone say it out loud meant everything. She carried Oliver back to their apartment, laying him gently in his crib. She sat on the floor beside him, watching his peaceful face as he slept. She reached into her pocket, pulling out the $100 bill, running her fingers over the crisp paper. Maybe, just maybe, things were starting to change. And little did she know, this was only the beginning. A week passed, and life continued as it always did for Emma, busy, exhausting, but filled with small moments of joy. Oliver's laughter when she tickled his belly, the way he wrapped his tiny arms around her neck when she picked him up, the sweet way he whispered, "Mama," before drifting off to sleep. Those moments kept her going. At the diner, the usual customers came and went. Walter stopped by for his regular meal, and though he didn't say much about the last time she paid for him, she noticed a slight warmth in his voice when he greeted her. He even left a crumpled dollar as a tip, something he never used to do. It wasn't much, but Emma knew what it meant. But as the days passed, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. She thought about the man who had overheard her conversation with Walter. The way he had watched her, the way he had spoken. "I'll be seeing you again, Emma." She wondered if he had just been passing through, or if he really meant it. She got her answer on a quiet Thursday afternoon. The diner was nearly empty, the lull between lunch and dinner giving Emma a rare moment to breathe. She was wiping down the counter when the bell above the door jingled. She looked up and there he was. The same man, wearing a tailored coat and polished shoes, his presence calm but commanding. He wasn't flashy, but something about him carried weight, as if he had built his life on decisions that changed things. Emma straightened. "Welcome back," she said, forcing herself to sound normal. The man smiled. "Told you I'd be seeing you again." She folded her arms, raising an eyebrow. "You weren't just passing through, were you?" He chuckled, shaking his head. "No, Emma. I came back because I have something for you." Her stomach tightened. She didn't like surprises, not when life had taught her that they were usually bad. "What do you mean?" He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. "I've thought a lot about what I saw last week. And I don't say this lightly, you are the kind of person the world doesn't see enough of anymore." Emma stared at the envelope but didn't reach for it. "Sir, Before you say no," he interrupted gently, "hear me out." She hesitated, then nodded. "I built my life from nothing," he continued. "I know what it's like to struggle. I know what it's like to count every dollar, to wonder how you're going to make it to the next day. But I also know the value of kindness. People think success comes from just hard work. But I believe it also comes from the people we choose to lift up along the way." He slid the envelope closer to her. "Inside this is $10,000. Emma's heart stopped. "I also have a job opportunity for you," he added before she could speak. "I run several businesses. One of them is a hospitality company: hotels, restaurants, places where people like you make the biggest difference. I need managers, people who understand hard work and kindness. People who don't just see customers but people. Emma's breath caught in her throat. A job. He nodded. A real one. A stable one. With better hours, better pay, and benefits. Something that lets you spend more time with your son. Emma opened her mouth, then closed it. The words weren't coming. She was used to struggling. Used to working herself to the bone just to keep the lights on. And now in front of her was something that could change everything. She stared at the envelope. She had never held that much money in her hands. Her mind raced with what it could mean. Rent paid ahead, food in the fridge, new clothes for Oliver. Maybe even a day where she didn't have to worry about which bill to pay first. But the job, that was what stuck with her the most. It's a future. A real one. Emma swallowed hard. Why, she whispered. Why me? The man leaned forward slightly, his expression serious but kind. Because people like you don't come around often. And when they do, they deserve a chance. Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the envelope. She didn't open it, but she felt the weight of it in her hands. It was real. This was real. She looked up at him, emotions swirling inside her. I don't know what to say. Say yes, he said simply. Emma let out a shaky laugh, wiping at the tears that had started to form. Yes, she whispered. The man grinned. Good choice. And just like that, her life changed. Emma barely slept that night. She had counted every bill in the envelope twice, her hands shaking as she did. $10,000. Enough to change the course of her life in an instant. She had cried hard when Oliver was asleep, letting out all the emotions she had been holding in for years: relief, shock, gratitude. She wanted to tell someone, but there was no one except her sleeping son, and he was too young to understand. Still, her mind kept circling back to something else. The money was life-changing, yes, but the job offer. That was what mattered most. The next morning, she was back at Gracie's diner for her shift, but something felt different. The weight she had carried for so long, the constant tightness in her chest, was a little lighter. And then, like clockwork, Walter walked in. She smiled as she poured him a cup of coffee. Morning, Walter. He nodded. Morning, dear. She set his usual breakfast down in front of him, but today he studied her longer than usual. His sharp old eyes weren't easily fooled. Something's different. Emma hesitated. What do you mean? Walter huffed. I've been coming here for over a year now. I've seen you work yourself ragged, always with a smile. Today that smile isn't hiding as much. Emma bit her lip. She hadn't planned to tell him, but she also knew that if anyone deserved to hear it, it was Walter. She pulled out the envelope, holding it gently in her hands. Someone saw what I did for you last week, she said carefully. A man. He came back yesterday with this. She hesitated, then added, and a job offer. Walter's eyebrows lifted slightly. A job. She nodded. A real one. With better hours, better pay. Something that means I won't have to be away from Oliver so much. The old man leaned back in his booth, processing her words. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his weathered face. Well, I'll be damned. Emma laughed softly. I guess kindness really does come back around, huh? Walter took a sip of his coffee, nodding. It does. Just not always this quickly. He eyed her with something close to pride. You deserve this, Emma. Don't you doubt that for a second. She swallowed past the lump in her throat. Thank you, Walter. Don't thank me, he said gruffly. I didn't do anything. But they both knew that wasn't true. That afternoon, Emma left the diner for what she realized might be one of the last times. She had called the number the man had given her and set up a meeting. He had arranged for her to visit one of his hotels downtown, where he wanted to introduce her to the team. Her hands were clammy as she stepped through the glass doors of the grand lobby. It was nothing like the diner: bright chandeliers, polished floors, guests moving in and out with expensive luggage. Emma felt out of place. But then she thought of Oliver, of the future she wanted for him, and she straightened her shoulders. The receptionist led her to an office, where the man whose name she now knew was James Whitmore greeted her with a warm smile. "You came," he said, motioning for her to sit. Emma nodded. "I still can't quite believe this is happening." James chuckled. "Well, believe it." He handed her a folder. "This is everything you need to know about the position. Assistant manager. It'll be a learning curve, but I have no doubt you'll handle it just fine." Emma opened the folder, scanning the details. Paid training. Health benefits. A salary that was more than she had ever seen in her life. She looked up at him. "Why are you doing this for me?" James leaned back in his chair. "Because I believe in paying attention to the right people. Too many folks go through life doing good without anyone ever noticing. But people like you, Emma, you're the ones who deserve the chances." Emma exhaled shakily. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," James said simply. "By proving that kindness still exists." And with that, she signed the papers. Her new life had begun. Emma's first week at her new job felt like stepping into an entirely different world. Gone were the long hours of running between tables, the ache in her feet from double shifts, and the lingering worry about whether she would make enough in tips to cover rent. Instead, she found herself in an environment where people respected her, where she was learning new skills, and where she had stability for the first time in years. She spent her days shadowing the hotel's general manager, learning the ropes handling guest requests, overseeing staff, and managing operations. It was overwhelming at times, but she was determined to prove herself. Every time doubt crept in, she reminded herself, "I earned this." But the best part of it all? She finally had more time with Oliver. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she was able to pick him up before sunset. Instead of rushing home, exhausted and drained, she had the energy to play with him. She could sit with him at dinner instead of feeding him quickly and collapsing into bed. She could hold him a little longer, read him an extra bedtime story, and just be his mom. One evening, after another successful day at work, Emma sat on the living room floor with Oliver. He was giggling as he stacked his colorful blocks, only to knock them over again. She watched him with teary eyes, overwhelmed by the simple joy of the moment. "Happy?" Mama Oliver asked, his big brown eyes full of curiosity. Emma swallowed the lump in her throat and smiled. "Yeah, baby. Mama's happy." And for the first time in a long time, she truly meant it. A few weeks later, Emma walked into Gracie's diner, but this time, not as an exhausted waitress. She had the day off and was there for something important. Walter was already in his usual booth, sipping his coffee, his old military cap resting beside him on the table. When he saw Emma approaching, he raised an eyebrow. Well, look who's finally got some free time." Emma grinned as she slid into the seat across from him. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you, you know." Walter huffed. "I didn't do a thing." Emma shook her head. "Yes, you did. You reminded me that kindness matters. You made me want to do the right thing, even when things were hard. And that led me here." She reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope, this one much smaller than the one James had given her weeks ago. Walter eyed it warily. "What's this?" "A little something for you." Walter frowned. "I don't need charity." Emma chuckled. "It's not charity, it's gratitude." She slid it across the table. "Just open it." With a sigh, Walter opened the envelope. Inside was a gift certificate to a nearby steakhouse, one of the nicer ones, the kind that Walter would never spend money on himself. There was also a handwritten note. "Walter, thank you for your kindness and your service. Dinner is on me this time. Emma." For a long moment, Walter just stared at the note. His fingers, rough and weathered, traced the edges of the paper. Then, slowly, he chuckled, shaking his head. You really are something else, you know that. Emma smiled. I learned from the best. Walter exhaled, then carefully folded the note and tucked it into his pocket like something valuable. Well, he muttered, clearing his throat. I suppose I'll have to accept. Emma grinned. You'd better. They sat there for a while, chatting about nothing in particular, about the weather, about Oliver, about how Emma was adjusting to her new job. And for the first time, Walter spoke a little more about his past. Not much, but just enough. And Emma listened, because she knew how much it mattered to be heard. Later that evening, as Emma tucked Oliver into bed, she thought about how much had changed in just a few short weeks. She thought about how one small act of kindness, paying for a simple meal, had led to something bigger than she could have ever imagined. She thought about Walter, about James Whitmore, about the way life had a funny way of bringing the right people together at the right time. She thought about Oliver's future, how bright it suddenly seemed. And as she kissed her son goodnight, she whispered a silent promise to herself to always choose kindness, no matter what. Because kindness had changed her life. And one day she knew it would change someone else's too.